Hi, I'm Luke, the pastor of St Kilda and Balaclava Presbyterian Church. So this is our second video, and we're continuing on our series in the book of Genesis. This particular series is called Genesis 1 to 11, the beginning of everything. Take a look at the previous video for Genesis chapters 1 to 5, an overview. And then today we're looking at the story of Noah. And I've called this sermon, or this talk, this video, Judgment in the Time of Coronavirus. We'll talk more about the judgment aspect and how it relates to the coronavirus a little bit later in this video. But right now I thought it'd be good to see a trailer from the 2014 film of Noah starring Russell Crowe. And it's just worth remembering that as we take a look at the trailer, that it's fan fiction. So sometimes it takes imaginative liberties, sometimes it feels like it's following the story very accurately. But there's one thing that the movie gets really wrong, and I want to bring that out later in this talk. But let's take a look at the trailer right now.
No. What did he say?
He's going to destroy the world.
My father said that one day, if man continued in his ways, the Creator would annihilate this world.
Can it not be averted?
He speaks to you. You must trust that he speaks in a way that you can understand.
I saw water, death by water. And I saw new life. A great flood is coming. We build a vessel to survive the storm. We build an ark.
Mama! What is it? Oh, them!
What do you want?
You don't know your king.
There isn't anything for you here.
I have men at my back, and you stand alone and defy me.
I'm not alone.
It begins.
When they come, they will be desperate, and there will be many.
Take the ark!
I see how hard this was for you.
Remember, Noah, he chose you for a reason.
Is this the end of everything?
Beginning. Beginning of everything.
So that'll hopefully give you a bit of an overview of the story and remind you of the key moments. Now, what I'd like to take a look at, or just to remind you, just do a quick recap. Genesis 1 to 5 builds the foundation of the story that fills out the rest of the Bible. And it's worth just highlighting from Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and Eve do this terrible swap. They swap their current life with God for a life of what ultimately leads to death. And so they do this swap between life with God and death with the devil. And that's the source of evil. That's the source of both the way in which the world is broken and the way in which people are corrupted. This bad swap. Also worth noting from chapter 3 is that God gives us over to this exchange. God lets us live that out. He gives us over to our evil. And then there's the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4 illustrates, sadly, that the end of sin is death. the final destination where sin will take you is ultimately death. So it's just worth keeping those three ideas in mind as we look at chapters 6 and 7. So I wanted to just take a moment to think about the idea of judgment, because judgment is a symbol. Now, I'm going to explain what judgment is a symbol of in a moment, but I want you to see that in Genesis 1 to 5, we have, by my count, just 9, but definitely more symbols. But I just wanted to show you that with these 9 examples, that the language of the Bible is symbolic. I mean, obviously this is a narrative, and it's telling a story. It has all the characteristics of a story, a plot, characters, setting. But I just wanted to show you that there's also the Scripture uses symbols. So I just wanted to highlight these symbols to show you how symbols work in the biblical narrative. Different types of symbols. So for example, God says that creation is good 7 times. There's a 7-fold structure to the creation week. So there's this sort of symbolic number of 7. The 7 generations from God that you see in Genesis chapter 5, and what happens with Enoch on the 7th generation. And so there's kind of this pattern of 7, and that's obviously continued throughout Scripture. But 7 is a symbol of goodness and order. And then there's the moment where God breathes life into Adam, creates him out of the mud from the ground, and breathes life into him through his nostrils. So there's this image that life is breathed in. And then there's the 4 rivers around the Garden of Eden, and they each have a particular name and a particular description. And then we have the fact that Adam and Eve are created naked, and then when they make that exchange, swapping life with God for death with the devil, then they're ashamed. They realize that they're naked. And so you have their nakedness as a symbol pre-fall of a lack of no sense of sin, no sense of evil doing, and then after the fall, it's a symbol of shame. And then you have the fruit that they eat from the tree of life, the fruit that they're not meant to eat, and then from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. There's also the fruit from the tree of life as well, but they're not meant to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we're not quite told what that fruit is. And obviously the fruit is a symbol. The fruit, there's more going on than meets the eye. Then there's that mysterious prophecy that Eve receives about one of her descendants who's going to crush the serpent's head but be bitten in the process. When God speaks to Adam, he talks about the ground being cursed with thorns and thistles. Now clearly the ground is cursed with other things as well. The brokenness of creation is larger than just thorns and thistles. So thorns and thistles are a symbol. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, and the direction that God picks is east of Eden. Now when Moses edits and collates the stories of Genesis, when he reminds the reader that they're cast out east of Eden, he's employing a symbol, and God's helping Moses, and therefore us as the readers, realize that east of Eden means exile from God. It's a symbol of being separated from God. And then there's these sort of battle angels. I'm not sure what that picture is. It's some sort of picture from the Old Masters showing some sort of... when I searched for Nephilim, that's what came up. And these searching for Nephilim, but I wanted to illustrate cherubim. And cherubim are the warrior angels, the battle angels that God puts around the Garden of Eden to stop Adam and Eve from having access to God. It's a symbol of, it's ultimately a symbol of death. It's a symbol because there's also a sword as well, which is another symbol of judgment and separation from God. So we see from these 9 examples that Scripture uses symbols, and Scripture uses a diversity of symbols. And let's just think briefly what the flood is a symbol of. So the flood is a symbol of being given over to sin and being rescued from sin. So that's the flood, that's what it represents. But just going back for a moment to what a symbol is, before we get into what the flood is a symbol of, symbols have sort of 2 aspects. They're physical and they're supernatural. So symbols exist. It's kind of obvious and a bit of a truism, but it's worth noting that symbols exist, and symbols exist on a spectrum of concreteness through to abstraction. Let's just go back to those examples just for a moment, just so you understand what I'm saying. So 7, it's an abstraction. The number 7's an abstraction. It's not concrete. I can pass you, or not now because we're all in isolation, but once we're out of isolation I can pass you 7 oranges, but I can't actually pass you the number 7. I mean, I could write the number 7 on a piece of paper and you can see the number 7 here on the screen. And so whereas, so for example, the serpent is this actual slithery thing that creeps into the garden, and thorns and thistles can hurt you and actually exist. Whereas the names of the rivers, they're just names, but then the rivers themselves exist in some form. So with each of these symbols, particularly, let's take example the fruit. Obviously the fruit exists, but we're not told where exactly on that spectrum of abstraction to concreteness that fruit sits. We know it exists, but is the fruit God's way of describing something more complex, something that Adam and Eve desired and shouldn't have eaten, but something that transmitted the knowledge of good and evil to them? Each of these symbols, they exist. So obviously the battle angels sort of exist as these barrier between Adam and Eve, but they're not just there sort of floating on the edge of Garden of Eden, whatever that exactly looked like, but they're a symbol of something. They're a symbol of separation from God. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that a symbol might exist in a tangible sense, or it might exist in an abstract sense, but it still exists. And symbols, of course, need to stand out, so they jump out from the narrative. Now, symbols aren't just physical, whether they exist in our imagination or in our language, or they are tangible, but symbols are also supernatural, particularly in Scripture. Symbols have an underlying meaning. They point not just to an underlying literary meaning or an underlying psychological meaning. A good symbol, when a symbol stands out, it often will have an associated memory in our mind. It'll make us think of something. It'll make us feel something. So the more a symbol stands out, the more it'll do that. But because if God exists, and if God and humans wrote Scripture together, and miracles exist, and God really works in the world, then these symbols don't just have literary meanings and psychological meanings, they have supernatural meaning as well. And a way of kind of understanding that is to think of it as a gateway. You might have heard that phrase, gateway drug. You take a particular drug, too much of a particular drug, and then it leads you to being addicted to other types of drugs. Or you might have heard about it in science fiction. Remember that show? Or that started as a movie, and then I think it became a show, Stargate, where they travel through this portal. Or think of the old classic Wardrobe, where you travel from this world into Narnia. That's what a symbol is. It's a gateway. It takes you from this world into another, or it shows you an aspect of this world that you didn't realize existed. So keep that in mind about symbols. Symbols have these physical dimensions, and symbols in Scripture have a supernatural dimension. They have a supernatural meaning. They're a gateway to a supernatural, a miraculous understanding of the world. So the flood is a symbol of, and it's, there's the water is tangible. The ark is built of things. It has creatures inside the ark. The people who are killed by the flood exist, but that whole story of the flood, of God's judgment, is a symbol. And it's a symbol of being given over to sin, which we saw already from Genesis 1 to 5. That's what happens. God gives us over to sin as part of his response to Adam and Eve's bad swap. But also it's not all bad news, because we're rescued from sin, and the flood shows us that as well. So let's take a look at being given over to sin. So in the narrative, we see that in Genesis chapter 6 that God says, "My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years." And this continues that theme of diminishing ages in Genesis chapter 5, where the ages of Adam's successors get smaller and smaller because they're further and further away from God. Because they're no longer living in the supernatural presence of the tree of life and have access to God, that almost superhero ability, to use that image, is wearing off. They're becoming less like superheroes, less powerful, less supernatural, more mortal. And so you see that in verse 3 of chapter 6, where God is laying out the boundary of being given over to sin. It's almost as though God is saying, you'll have this lifespan where you'll see sin being played out in your life and being played out in the world, and then it's all over. And then you'll be given completely over to sin. I won't contend with humans forever. Man is mortal. His days will be numbered. And then in verse 7 of chapter 6, God says, "I'm going to destroy humans, which I have created from the face of the earth." I'm going to destroy humans. I'm going to destroy the creatures. I'm going to destroy everything, for I am grieved that I have made them. So there's this statement where God says, that's it. I'm going to start over, because humans have been given over to sin, and they've run with that and embraced this bad swap that they've chosen. They've lived that out, and you get that little description of wickedness in verse 5, of violence, of people becoming corrupted. Verse 12, God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. So there's this God allowing people to live it out, and then people living out this choice. Verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. So there's the sad embracing of Adam and Eve's choice, which is why it's followed by the terrifying destruction in chapter 7. So that's why chapter 7 is filled with this description of first the gathering in of all the creatures into the ark, and then the destroying of all the creatures and all the people outside the ark. And it's this horrifying end point of being given over to sin, being given over to death, and it all ending in this cataclysm of destruction. And now it's kind of worth just thinking a little bit about death and the coronavirus. We're living in partial lockdown. Maybe in a few days' time it'll be complete lockdown because we're wanting to not overburden the health system, because we know that there's not enough ventilators, there's not enough intensive care beds, which means that people, if too many people are sick with coronavirus at once, it means that people will die. They'll have to triage and decide who gets the ventilator and who doesn't, who gets the intensive care bed and who doesn't. And those that don't will probably or might likely die. And behind that, if the health system collapses, is this fear of general civil unrest and the deeper dystopia that follows that, which would mean in a shorter, sudden, more brutal death. And so that's kind of what humans are thinking about collectively at the moment as we face the pandemic. Is we're looking past the shortages and the economic depression and recession, and looking past the health system collapse and the civil unrest, and then behind it all, our death and the death of those that we love. And so we're seeing in the coronavirus, we're seeing the danger of death. Now, we're talking about the story of Noah, and the story of Noah is this sort of classic case study in judgment. God destroys most of the world as an act of judgment because the world has become violent, because people have given themselves over completely to sin. So the question is this judgment specific or universal? So I think the answer is neither. Well, the answer is actually, as you can see in the slide, neither, and it's also specific, and it's also universal. But let's just think for a moment of Job, because when Job, in the story of Job, when Job has everything taken away from him, his wife wants Job to curse God, because God's the God in charge. God's the one who's taken things away. God's the one who controls the judgment. And Job says, well, shouldn't we also accept bad things as well as good things? I mean, bad things and good things come from God. Just a quick tangent there. I'm sort of loosely paraphrasing Job, and Job's comment is not saying that when God allows something to happen, when God allows judgment to happen, when God allows people to live out their corruption, he's not approving it. He's in control. He allows it. But it is not saying that I approve of this corruption. I approve of this bad thing. But he's allowing it to take place. So when Job says to his wife, well, God's allowed both of these things to happen. The blessings that we had previously and the judgment we're experiencing now. And so we see from the beginning of that part of Job, from Job's comment to his wife, that judgment, the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. Judgment can't necessarily be linked to a particular sin. But is judgment perhaps linked to particular sins in a particular individual's life, or a particular community's, what a particular community has done? And you see when Jesus is confronted with this, and when he heals the blind man, he's asked, what's the source of this man's blindness? Is there a particular thing that he's done, or a particular thing that his parents have done? And Jesus just heals the man, because it's not the fact that the man is blind is a product of all of our sin. It's a product of Adam's sin. It's a fact that the world is broken that's caused that man to be blind, and that's why Jesus has come into the world, is to rescue us from that brokenness and that corruption of sin. And so Jesus is highlighting the fact that there's nothing in particular that this man did. There's no, his dad didn't cheat on his taxes, which then meant his son was given over to blindness, or his mum stole something from work, which then meant the son was given over to blindness, or the son did a particular sin which caused him to be blind. Yet we see, I've got here the reference to Corinthians, but you think about the book of Acts, you think about Ananias and Sapphira, who withhold some money when the early church is donating money to support the ministry of the early church, and they do this kind of complicated thing where they withhold some money and pretend to give. The amount that they give isn't the amount that they actually have, and because they lie about this, they're struck dead. And then Paul reminds us that in the Corinthian church, some of the people are suffering because of their sin. So in a way, when you think about judgment, you think, is judgment judgment because of some sort of universal sin, because of what everybody's doing, or is judgment what a particular person does? Then the answer's ambiguous. The answer is multifaceted. It kind of depends, because clearly it is a universal symbol. Clearly, judgment is a symbol for everyone. The judgment of the flood and the coronavirus is a symbol that God gives us over to sin, that the end of sin is death. But as you can see there on my slide, you've got to, the answer is when you start thinking about specifics, the answer is a little more complicated. There's a recent clip where Tim Keller is asked by one of the American news organizations about judgment and about the coronavirus, and Tim Keller explains that there's not a direct correlation. You can't draw a direct correlation because Scripture doesn't draw a direct correlation. Sometimes the judgment that comes across everybody isn't necessarily linked to a specific sin, but what it is an ultimate symbol. It's a big symbol that sin ends in death. But it's not necessarily linked to a particular person's sin or a particular community's sin. I don't know if you remember that a while ago. There were the big bushfires in Victoria back in 2009, and I think it was Catch the Fire Ministries. One of those organisations wanted to link that particular fire with particular laws passed in Victoria. And I think that's the connection that you can't make. that Scripture, the complexity of Scripture doesn't let you make. You can't link, for example, there was an earthquake recently in Salt Lake City, and it damaged the main Mormon temple, and I think the angel, the statue of the angel on top of the main Mormon temple was damaged or fell off or something like that. You can't say that if because as Christians we believe that Mormonism is a heresy and not orthodox. We can't say, that's a particular judgment on Mormonism or on Salt Lake City. But what we can say is that earthquakes, plagues, pandemics, and the flood are a symbol, a universal symbol of God's judgment to show us that we're given over to sin. But we're also rescued from sin. And in the building of the ark, so there's the first half of, the second half of Genesis chapter 6, and then the first half of Genesis chapter 7. God gives the instructions to Noah to build the ark. Noah builds the ark, and then God supernaturally gathers the animals in and brings them inside the ark and organizes them in a supernatural way. And the ark and the gathering of the animals, the rescue of a selection of animals, the rescue of a selection of humans, the building of a particular safe haven is a symbol. It's a symbol within a symbol of the way in which God rescues us from sin. And there's also a symbol not just of how salvation works in general, but also a symbol of the way in which we belong to Jesus. Because when we belong to Jesus, it's almost as though we're inside the ark of Jesus' salvation. So when Jesus dies and rises from the dead, we're inside that ark. We belong to Jesus. We belong to his work. Now this is where we come to the bit that I'm frustrated by the Noah film, because crucially, God shuts the door of the ark. So in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16, all the animals go in as God and the animals were going in, all the male and female of every living thing, as God had commanded Noah. And then the second half of verse 16, then God shut him in. God shuts the door of the ark. And this is what the movie gets wrong. So let's just jump to that clip where the door is closed.
Protect your mother. Protect them all.
I don't know if you saw it there, but that moment where Russell Crowe grabs the rope and kind of tugs down, and there's the people rushing forward and the water's pouring in. It's because part of the problem with the film of Noah is that it overemphasizes Noah's obedience. And while it's Noah is held up as an example to us of faithfulness, we've also got to remember that it's God who rescues Noah. It's not Noah's resourcefulness, Noah's particular obedience that saves the human race, that saves those animals from judgment. It's God who closes the door of the ark, not Noah. Because that's how our salvation works. It's not our particular obedience or sinfulness, but it's God who rescues us. It's God who saves us from sin. And so that's Genesis chapters 6 and 7, judgment in the time of coronavirus. The flood is a symbol of God's judgment, where we're given over to sin, but we're rescued from sin. Thanks a lot.